Jeremiah Jonathan Boyer was born December 5, 1973, in Lebanon, Pennsylvania. Jeremiah Boyer is a son to Ruby Jean and Gerald Boyer, and a brother to Gerald Jr., Sherry, and Kelly. Jeremiah Boyer chose to enter the Navy because his father was in the Navy, and, as he says,
my dad was in the Navy, and the job that I was offered in the Navy, I got to learn a skill and plus get to shoot guns.
Jeremiah Boyer doesn't remember many of his instructors at boot camp, which was in Great Lakes, Illinois, but he said his experience was the same as everyone else's.
It was organized chaos. It took us a couple of weeks until we all started working as a team. You know, they break you down, take away the civilian, and then they put you in the military mindset.
The part he found hardest was the sleep deprivation, but overall he found it very easy to adapt to military life. Right out of boot camp, Jeremiah Boyer went to Lakehurst, New Jersey, and went through chemical, biological, and nuclear warfare school. He was held in Lakehurst as a combat replacement after the initial invasion of Iraq. After being held as a combat replacement, he went to Fort Belvoir, Virginia, and then Port Hueneme, California. In Port Hueneme, Jeremiah Boyer said,
we were working up to, that was our training site to work up to go over to Iraq. So that was like urban combat, convoy operations. We did a bunch of different things, out there.
After leaving Port Hueneme, he was sent overseas to the Ali Al Salim Air Base in Kuwait. There, Jeremiah Boyer said,
we flew into Ali Al Salim Air Base, and then from there we got the group that I was with. We were kind of a little bit of a different specialized unit. There was 24 of us. They separated us from the rest of the battalion. They had us, the camp that we stayed in, they had us pretty much segregated from everybody else, and we trained. We trained 12, 14 hours a day. We did that for about 3 weeks, and then there was a place out there, it was called the Udari Range. We went out there with all the specialized weapons.
The Udari Range in Kuwait surrounds Camp Buring, which is 25 miles away from the Iraqi border. After about a week in the Udari Range, Jeremiah Boyer said,
and then they said, we're pushing north. We did convoy security and took roughly 125 people and different equipment, and we pushed up north into Baghdad, towards Baghdad.
On the way to Baghdad, he said,
I'm up there, I was on top of a Humvee. I was a crew served weapons gunner. So we went from checkpoint to checkpoint, and then once we hit Baghdad, from Kuwait to Baghdad, we could travel during the day. And then once we got close to Baghdad, we could only travel at night after 11 o'clock because of the IED threats and, the hostile activity.
Because of the night travels, most of the people switched to night vision goggles. Mr. Boyer, however, did not.
You have absolutely no depth perception, and you get a headache from it. Actually, for me, being on top of a Humvee, it was actually easier for me not to wear my night vision goggles, so if we were getting shot at, I could see the muzzle flashes a lot easier. In country, probably 3 hours, and we got into our first ambush. That was right by Diwaniyah.
Diwaniyah is just south of Baghdad. After arriving in Baghdad, they went east into Fallujah, dropped some people and supplies off, and then went to Ramadi 2 or 3 days later.
That's pretty much where my mailing address was in Ramadi.
Jeremiah Boyer was a crew-served weapons gunner for most of his service.
I was a machine gunner, just like they show in the movies.
Most of what he did for his service was escorting groups between Baghdad and Fallujah. Mr. Boyer was with the same group of men for the majority of his service. When asked what kind of friendships he made in the service, he responded with,
really close ones. Real close. It was kind of different because we were such a small group and how we operated and things like that. You could be in a dark room, and one of the guys would go walking by, and you could tell just by the way his footsteps were, you knew who it was. That's how close we were.
The area that Mr. Boyer served in was vastly different from what he had in his hometown of Lebanon.
You know, the oil comes out of the ground. It's like water here.
Mr. Boyer remarked after seeing one picture he had taken overseas. Another challenge with the terrain was sandstorms.
To stop in the middle of a mission from a sandstorm. That's when the sandstorm was coming in. You can see from his shoulders down. But that's how they would come in. They'd come rolling in like that off the desert, and then they just. I was in like 3 or 4 of them. Two of them were really bad. The other 2 weren't so bad, but yeah, it would happen. It's ridiculous. It's worse than fog. They just come out and it's like you could see them coming from pretty far away, and then all of a sudden they'd be on you. You'd be like, "She's a piece, you can't."
There were also camels that Mr. Boyer saw frequently.
We see more camels in Kuwait than we did in Iraq, but these white ones, they were, I don't know, for whatever reason, they're like a really big deal, because we weren't allowed to like even look at. They were like, don't even look at the camels. They get all weird about it. So I guess it kind of like compared them to like the Amish with their horse here, so that they needed them for to make a living and stuff like that.
Mr. Boyer returned home due to health issues and was not permitted to re-enlist. When asked to expand upon the health issues, Mr. Boyer said,
In Ramadi, it was one of Uday Hussein's palaces. And right aside of the palace was an Iraqi Special Forces. Well, that's where they used to be. That was their base. So that's where we stayed. And some of the things that went on prior to us getting there, and when Saddam was in charge and stuff, nobody really knows what happened there. But a bunch of us ended up getting sick, and I ended up with a flesh-eating bacteria that started in my leg and then went up through my groin into my abdomen, and I just kept, this is right after we came home, because we kept getting different infections on our feet and our ankles and stuff, and we didn't know if it was from running through the city in the streets, because there was always sewage, and because they didn't have any, not like here in the United States, they didn't have toilets and stuff, they just went in the streets and stuff. So some of us started getting really sick. We had these infections, and mine manifested and turned into a flesh-eating bacteria, and I ended up in the hospital for almost a month. I was in a drug-induced coma for about 2 weeks, and they ended up having to cut my abdominal wall out before it got into my lungs and my heart from this flesh-eating bacteria. So they cut so much of my muscle out, they tried pulling everything back together, but the hole was too big, so they had to go in there and put mesh.
The doctors proceeded to put mesh in as a replacement. Mr. Boyer did explain that his surgeries were done at home in the States, and that he had his family's support through it all, even though some people were a bit rattled. Overall, Mr. Boyer had a hard time adjusting to returning home. When asked what was the hardest, he said,
The structure, the little things that people let bother them, that I sat there and I was like, you're sitting here worrying about what time you have to go for groceries, this is a joke, you know what I mean, stuff like that. And
his family members did comment that he was a bit different coming home.
Came home, and the way they explained it to me, I was very different. I was a little more straightforward, a little more assertive, you know what I mean? I was a different person.
In conclusion, Mr. Jeremiah Boyer was a crew-served machine gunner who served in Iraq. Mr. Boyer, we thank you for your service.